She was found slumped against the stone wall, her breath shallow, her lips cracked from rust and cold, her chin dark with the dried seam of blood where flesh had given way to iron. The mask had not been removed, not even in death. They feared what she might say if the metal ever loosened. Beneath her, the straw was soaked with filth, with urine, with the sick rot of a body made to fester in silence. The bridle had fused into her jaw, the bit resting cruelly on her tongue, splitting it, flattening it, turning speech into a wound. She could not scream, she could not beg, and so she became a still life of state-approved punishment. A woman, bridled like an animal, displayed like meat left to rot in the cellars of justice. They called her Agnes Cutter. Her name was spoken only once in the official logbooks of Norfolk Jail, scrawled hastily between a thief and a debtor. Agnes Cutter, scold. Correction by Bridle. February 1587, that was all. But the townspeople knew her. They whispered her name like a spell, half in fear, half in awe. She was the woman who spoke too often, too sharply, too truthfully, and for that they forged her a silence. In those days, the scold's bridle was seen as a civil tool, an answer to disorder. A rusted iron cage shaped to clamp the head and seal the mouth, its central spike pushing the tongue down like a stake through heresy. A woman could be marched through the market, bound in this cage, as butchered pigs and cracked potatoes spilled around her feet. The children would laugh, the men would sneer. The women would look away, or look harder, as though punishing her might protect themselves. For it was not just speech that was bridled, it was fear. The fear that if one tongue could ripple through a village, then all tongues must be shackled in turn. And yet, there had been a time, however brief, when Agnes had not worn iron, when her voice, sharp as it was, served as alarm. She had warned of the baker who weighed bread with stones. She had spoken of the priest who drank until his sermons slurred. She had named the midwife who let 2 babies die unattended. She had spoken in defense of another woman, flogged in the square after a man claimed insult. For every tongue she lashed with words, there had been a truth they were unwilling to name. But truth, when spoken by a woman, was not called justice. It was called insolence. The blacksmith who forged her bridle was paid 2 shillings and 6pence. He was not told her name. He did not need it. All he was given was a list of measurements: skull width, jaw height, distance from gum to throat. The mask was made for her body, but not for her soul. No tool ever is. As he hammered, sparks danced across the anvil like devils at play, and when he plunged the finished bridle into a barrel of water, the steam hissed like a thing alive. That was the sound of civility, they said, the sound of order. But what kind of justice cuts the voice and calls it peace? Her trial, if one can call it that, lasted less than an hour. No advocate stood for her. No witness was called. A man stood at the front of the chapel room and read from a parchment, Agnes Cutter, for scolding, sedition, and disorderly tongue, to be corrected by bridle under the Queen's grace. No defense was recorded. None was permitted. She was dragged by her hair through the square, her dress soiled from the puddles, her wrists bound in rope that burned like confession. The children threw cabbage stems. The older men called her names no book would print. One woman, her neighbor, spit upon her and muttered, "Should have kept your mouth shut." But before the mask was made, there was a fear, and that fear spoke. It is easy to forget how dangerous a voice can be, how power recoils from a sentence like a serpent from salt. In Tudor England, silence was not just obedience. It was currency. A silent wife made for a proud husband, a silent daughter, a virtuous name. And yet here was Agnes, undoing all that with nothing more than her tongue. The church called her impure, the court called her unruly, but the truth was simpler. She would not obey. In the cell where she died, the stone was etched with fingernail marks, lines scrawled in desperation or madness. Perhaps she counted the days. Perhaps she tried to write her name one final time. No one knows. No one looked. The mask was removed only after the rats had gathered. Today, the scold's bridle sits behind glass in a museum, polished, labelled, defanged. But it once lived. It once clamped upon wet skin and split tongues and made shame into theatre. And the woman who wore it, the one who refused to be quiet, lies somewhere unmarked, forgotten by paper but remembered in pain. What does it mean to be punished for speech? Not lies, not heresy, not treason, just speech. Is truth a virtue only when a man says it? They thought they had silenced her, but her silence still screams. And before they silenced her, someone gave her the words. Long before the mask, there was the mouth, and long before the mouth, there was the hunger, for truth, for correction, for justice, not filtered through parchment and patriarchs. In the winding dirt lanes of Tudor England, justice did not begin in courtrooms. It was whispered in kitchens, bartered in taverns, sharpened at the lips of midwives, and passed through alleyways like flame beneath frost. And for a time, in the small parish of Walsingham, there was a woman who wielded words like flint, Agnes Cutter. She was not born to power. She did not inherit land. She bore no crest, no dowry, no title. Her worth came from her memory. She remembered who had lied, who had stolen, who had confessed too freely over cider or clutched bruises in places sleeves could not cover. She remembered which sacks of flour were measured light and which babies died in silence. She remembered, and she spoke. In an age where silence was piety and obedience was virtue, memory was rebellion. The people had names for women like her: scold, fishwife, harlot, witch. The law used common brawler or woman of unquiet spirit. But the women knew. The women listened. They leaned closer when Agnes spoke of the steward's forged weights, or the physician's tinctures that cured nothing and rotted the liver. In back kitchens and beneath church eaves, her words moved like weather, filling ears, clouding trust, thundering against the roofs of men who had never once been questioned aloud. But the crown was listening too. In 1533, the royal proclamation against seditious words laid its ink across the mouths of commoners. By 1540, local magistrates in Kent and Lincolnshire were recording complaints of female railing with increasing urgency. What had once been dismissed as domestic squabble was now marked as potential sedition. Because England was trembling. Henry VIII's split from Rome had cleaved more than churches. It had ruptured the soul of the kingdom. In a nation where allegiance shifted like wind, every word became a weapon. And yet, Agnes Cutter rose in this storm, not as a noble or rebel, but as a woman with a tongue too precise for comfort. She held no scripture, but she remembered debts. She wore no armor, but she remembered crimes. And in the fragile lattice of Tudor society, where a single whisper could unravel a man's position, her presence became intolerable. Her voice was not melodic. It was coarse, ragged, tired from too many nights watching over dying neighbors or delivering infants with broken limbs. But it was trusted. Her tongue carried weight not because it flattered, but because it did not bend. She accused the parish priest of thieving alms for his cellar. She named the baron's son in the rape of a housemaid who hanged herself near the church wall. She stood in the square during the feast of St. Stephen and asked, in plain voice, "Why does God's justice never fall upon men with land?" No one answered, but they remembered. She should have been ignored. She was a woman, aging, unlettered. But the people repeated her, and repetition, unlike rebellion, spreads without warning. In the spring of 1586, a baker was publicly beaten for selling hollow loaves. The charge? Reported by the widow Cutter. That was the moment her words entered the records, not as witness, but as weapon. What does it mean when a voice becomes dangerous? Not because it lies, but because it reminds. In the surviving fragment of a court ledger from Walsingham, her name appears next to a crude notation: infectious speech. Infectious. Like plague. Like rot. Like something unseen that spreads without touch. And so they crafted a cure. But before the cure, there was glory. It is too easy to forget. Too easy to see her only as the woman in iron. But there was a time when mothers came to her door for help, when boys delivered firewood in thanks, when a midwife named her godmother to a child whose father had vanished. There was a time when her words didn't condemn, but rescued, when they saved a girl from a false marriage by revealing a hidden betrothal, when they exposed a hedge wizard whose poultices blistered skin. Her words mattered, her words had teeth, and for a brief moment in 1585, she was radiant. Not beautiful, radiant. A force, a reckoning in plain cloth, her hair greyed, her fingers cracked, her back bent, but her presence undeniable. She stood in the marketplace beside the butcher's stall and spoke of things no priest dared say. And when the magistrate passed, he tipped his hat, not in respect, but in fear. For she held no power, and yet he could not silence her. That is the paradox. Power is never comfortable with that which it cannot claim. It does not fear armies, for armies can be bought. It fears memory. It fears words. It fears women like Agnes. And so her name was added to a list. Quietly. Without trial. Without fanfare. A name written in the margins of a constable's book. Beside it, to be watched, to be bridled if necessary. As if she were a beast of burden. As if the weight of truth could be yoked with iron. They thought she had risen too far. They believed that a woman should build nothing louder than a child's lullaby. But she had built a following, a whisper chain of stories, confessions, and truths. She had built fear. But fear is always answered with force. And so, when they came for her, before dawn, without warrant or prayer, they dragged not just a woman from her bed. They dragged down the scaffolding of memory she had erected for a village that dared to see its sins. They believed they were ending her rise. But before the iron kissed her lips, she had already spoken enough to echo through centuries. And sometimes it is not the crown that makes a voice powerful. It is the dirt it dares to rise from. It was never a single word that condemned her. It was the accumulation, the slow, relentless sediment of truths dropped like stones in the village well, until the water turned black with fear. Agnes Cutter had no army, no parchment seal, no standing in court, but she had names, she had memories, and in a kingdom where silence was demanded, remembering became an act of sedition. The year was 1586, and something had shifted. Perhaps it was the harvest, blighted again. Perhaps it was the air, thick with rumours of plots against the Queen, of whispers from Spain, of fire waiting beneath the floorboards of loyalty. But in Walsingham, the shift had a name: Agnes. She had begun speaking too loudly, not with volume, but with precision. She said the steward's son had been seen leaving a widow's cottage before her death. She said the bishop's records didn't account for 2 shipments of church tithes. She said the town's physician let a beggar die untreated because he smelled of plague. Each accusation was simple, quiet, truthful. But each was also a thorn, one more prick in the bloated flesh of a village that wanted to believe in its own piety. What happens when you bruise a wound long denied? It opens. It wasn't just what she said. It was who began to listen. The fishmonger's wife stopped tithing. The seamstress refused to sew for the magistrate. The butcher's daughter repeated Agnes's words beneath the pulpit steps. Men began to lose their grip on the story. And when men lose their grip on the story, they reach for shackles. The moment it turned is buried in a field report, now yellowed with mould, found in the county archive with the ink faded to a whisper. It simply states, subject seen speaking with known recusant. Language suggests intent to stir unrest. No name for the recusant, no quote, just the suggestion, just enough. It was a cousin who betrayed her, a boy she had helped raise when his mother died. They said he came forward with trembling hands and a parchment in his pocket. He'd written down what she said in the market. The Queen is deaf to the cries of the poor. Her coin feeds war, not bread. Treason, they called it. But it was the sound of hunger, spoken plainly. And once that parchment touched the desk of a bailiff, the wheel began to turn. Quietly, as these things do. A knock at midnight, a search warrant with no signature, a question she was not allowed to answer. "Do you speak against the crown?" they asked, to which she replied, "I speak for those she's forgotten." That line, never officially recorded, was repeated by a constable's daughter until her death. They arrested her without charge. They did not beat her, not yet. They did not brand her, not yet. They let the silence do the work, locked her in the cold undercroft beneath the hall. No fire, no food, just time. Time to consider the weight of what she'd said. But Agnes was not afraid of silence. She had lived in its shadow her entire life. She had buried 3 children before they could walk. She had sat beside her husband as he bled from the mouth for days after a miner's collapse. She had watched friends disappear under charges of witchcraft and never return. Silence did not frighten her. Lies did. The court called it a hearing, but it had already been decided. Her words had stirred discomfort in too many men. The steward, the parish priest, the bishop's undersecretary, each with something to lose if her voice lingered too long. And so they invoked the Seditious Speech Act of 1581, an obscure clause rarely used, but potent. It allowed for corrective measures against slanderous utterances deemed harmful to social cohesion. What does it mean when truth is labeled poison? When speech, stripped of decoration, becomes more dangerous than sword or flame? She was offered leniency, confess, swear obedience, deny her statements. They would even let her return home, they said. But her reply, etched in the margins of an unknown scribe's journal, survives. I was not born with silence in my bones. I will not die with it in my throat. And so they chose the bridle, an old punishment almost forgotten, reserved for women, for scolds, for those who spoke too much, too sharply, iron jaws, tongue press, public shame. It was not a death sentence. That was the cruelty. You were meant to live with it. You were meant to be paraded through the square, a carnival of pain, a symbol to others. Speak, and you shall bleed. Resist, and you shall rot with your mouth full of rust." In the days before her punishment, she was not allowed ink. But one letter remains, smuggled by a jail cook's daughter. In it, Agnes wrote, "Do not grieve for me. It is better to be broken for truth than shaped by silence. They believe they are punishing the noise, but they are only proving its power." That letter never reached its destination. It was found sewn into the lining of a bread sack years later, when the daughter's granddaughter died, passed down like a relic, a blade wrapped in linen. And yet, the turning was not just in her cell. It happened across Walsingham. Women began to lower their eyes again. The whispers stopped. Shopkeepers nodded to the stewards they once avoided. The silence returned like a fog, thick, humming, palpable. This is the cruelty of history, that it does not merely punish rebellion, it teaches obedience through memory, and in doing so, it teaches forgetting. But there is one question, hidden beneath all this iron, all this rot. Is it the woman who speaks that creates the chaos, or the world that cannot bear to hear her? And if the bridle silenced her, why do we still hear her name? Agnes Cutter. Treason by truth, punished by order. And yet, even now, her voice survives in the wound. Once the sentence was passed, they no longer had to listen. Not to her, not to the murmur of protest at the edges of the square, not even to the sound of their own fear. Agnes Cutter had become a problem solved, a mouth shut, a ledger closed. But they misunderstood the nature of silence. They thought it ended things. They forgot that silence, when made by force, is not an absence. It is an echo pressed inward, a scream turned against the bones. They placed the bridle over her head, not with haste, but with ceremony. She was led into the center of the marketplace, wrists bound with twine damp from the morning frost. On the edge of the platform stood the constable, the magistrate, and the priest, not to bless, but to observe. The iron muzzle gleamed faintly, black with soot and oil, its jaw hinges stiff, its tongue bit polished like a relic. It was said to be a relic, in fact, first used on a tanner's wife in 1539, who had insulted the Lord Mayor's second cousin. The blacksmith had reshaped it for Agnes's jaw, widening the hinge, lengthening the spike, made to measure like a wedding ring. There were children in the crowd, holding hands, laughing. One girl, no older than 7, pointed at the mask and asked, "Is that for dogs?" Her mother pulled her close and said, "Nothing." The bridle was not a single device. It was a design of humiliation. Each town had its variation. In some, the bit was flat, meant only to suppress. In others, like the one Agnes wore, it was spiked. A metal plate drove down the center of the mouth, cutting into the tongue with every attempted word. Some included bells on the crown, so that the wearer's shame rang out with every step. In Agnes's case, they opted for silence. No bells, just steel. And so began the descent, not into darkness, but into display. The horror was public. That was the point. In a world governed by the gaze of others, punishment must be seen to be believed. They walked her through the lanes, past the bakery, where she once warned a girl about mold in the bread, past the tailor's, where she had shouted down a drunk steward, past the chapel, where she once sat in the third pew, whispering to a woman about bruises. The route was deliberate, a map of her defiance, turned into a parade of correction. She did not cry. That is what frightened them most. Witness accounts describe her eyes, dry, locked forward, neither pleading nor broken. One onlooker said, "She stared like someone already dead." Another swore she smiled, though it might have been the way the mask cut her lips. Memory is cruel like that. It arranges the truth to match comfort, but the streets remembered, and the windows stayed shuttered. Punishments of women were always layered. The bridle was iron, yes, but it was also ritual. It said, "Your voice is not yours." It said, "Shame walks before the crime." It said, "Do not forget who decides what you are allowed to say." And that message did not end with Agnes. In Staffordshire, a woman named Judith Lane was bridled 2 weeks later for railing against her husband's kin. In Kent, a midwife named Martha Gills was locked for refusing to name the father of a stillborn child. It spread, not like justice, but like infection. And yet, the men who sentenced her never mentioned her name again. In the borough minutes, the entry reads, "Scold correction carried out." No incident, no mention of blood, no mention of the boy who vomited into the straw when he saw her mouth begin to drip. No mention of the girl who tried to untie Agnes's wrists before being slapped away by a guard. Just a line to mark that history had moved on. But it hadn't, because even as her steps faltered, even as the metal pressed harder into the roof of her mouth, she refused to bow. She walked upright, slow, measured, a procession not of shame, but defiance carved in rust. She had spoken for those no one protected, and now, though she could no longer speak, her suffering became their warning, their mirror, their punishment to come. This is how power operates. It isolates one voice, punishes it in full view, and lets the watching silence do the rest. No scaffold, no execution, just the slow rot of memory, ensured by the publicness of pain. Control not through death, but through spectacle. What does it mean, then, when suffering is made performance, when pain is dressed in law and marched through cobbled streets for approval? By the time they returned her to the jail, she was no longer Agnes Cutter. Not to them, she was an object lesson, a deterrent, a ghost with breath. They left the bridle on, said it would remain until her attitude softened. But a tongue pierced cannot plead. A mouth clamped cannot confess. So she sat in silence, day by day, blood collecting in the back of her throat, flies gathering in the corners of the mask, straw stiff beneath her as her jaw began to lock, not from punishment, but from infection. Her body began its own descent, the slow, internal rebellion that cannot be punished further, because the flesh has learned to suffer in silence. There is a line in an anonymous letter, dated March 1587, unsigned, but preserved in the linen folds of a chaplain's notebook. She does not speak, but somehow she screams more now than ever before. Instruments of control do not merely bind, they transform. They take something human, laughter, breath, warmth, and recast it into a lesson. Agnes was no longer seen as a woman or even a prisoner. She was an instrument herself, a tool forged to teach fear, a mechanism of obedience, not by design, but by what she endured. And yet, something slipped, because the mask, meant to end her voice, instead engraved it, into the minds of children, into the bones of women who stood behind shutters, into the silence that came after, too deep to be called peace. And that silence, centuries later, still holds the shape of her scream. What breaks first, the flesh or the spirit? In the undercroft of Norfolk jail it was hard to tell. The air was damp and spoiled, the stone walls slick with cold that refused to lift even in the daylight hours. Beneath her, the straw grew mold-black, flattened by the weight of her body and the slow leak of blood. The iron bridle had not been removed, not even to clean. It had become a part of her, fastened at the crown with a lock that no jailer could be bothered to undo. She breathed through it. She bled through it. And as the days unraveled, her body became a theatre of infection. They said the tongue is the strongest muscle in the human body, but even strength must yield to rust and pressure. The spike that pressed down the center of her mouth, designed to keep her from speaking, had begun to bore into the tender tissue beneath. Every attempt to swallow scraped new flesh away. Her tongue swelled, not from use, but from injury, purple, then blackened. And still she did not cry out, could not. Her throat grew raw with the blood she could not spit, and every cough rattled like a prayer left unanswered. The skin around her lips blistered first. Friction burns from metal not cleaned since the bridle's last use. By the fourth day, those blisters had split open, revealing a pink, weeping wound at the corners of her mouth. Pus dribbled down her chin. It soaked into the collar of her shift. Flies arrived. Not many, just enough to remind her she was no longer separate from the rot. And still she was watched. Guards checked her, only to confirm she had not died in the night. A woman dying slowly was easier to explain than a woman silenced suddenly. She drank water when it was given, trickled down from a ladle held to her brow, like feeding a lamb too sick to lift its head. But she could not chew. The bit pressed too far back, so they stopped bringing food. Let her body learn to starve. Her gums bled. Her breath curdled. Ulcers bloomed at the base of her tongue, one so deep it exposed a pale line of sinew beneath. Her jaw stiffened, locked by swelling and the pressure of rusted hinges that had not been fitted with care. Every breath she drew came with a wet rattle. Sometimes, in the hours before dawn, she made a sound, a sort of hum, too soft to be called a moan, too broken to be called a prayer. It was the only sound she had left. In a physician's ledger dated 1589, 2 years after her death, there is an entry. Case of necrotic infection from tongue spike bridle. Patient not named. Tissue decay, possible gangrene. Death likely by septic fever. No name. No mention of Norfolk. But someone remembered. Someone examined the mask after. What they found was a tongue that had fused with the iron. The spike had not merely cut, it had embedded. The body, in its panic, had tried to heal around it. The tissue had grown upward, attempting to reclaim what had been torn. It failed, and so her body revolted. Fever overtook her limbs. Her skin burned with sweat even in the chill. Lice nested in her hairline. Her fingernails cracked from clutching the stone. And all the while, she remained upright, even when seated. Even as her spine began to curl from pain, even as her vision blurred, she held herself straight. Pride, they called it. Pride that needed punishment. But perhaps it was something else. Perhaps she simply refused to give them the satisfaction of watching her collapse. One night, no one knows which, she began to tremble. Not from cold, but from within. Her legs kicked against nothing. Her breath came in shallow, hiccuped gasps. Her eyes rolled. And still the bridle held firm, pressing metal into nerve. Her final torment was not the pain, but the silence. No scream, no plea. Just the rattle of a woman being hollowed from the inside out. What does it mean to die this way? Not from sword or fire or gallows, but by design. By an object crafted not to kill, but to unmake. They did not call it execution. There was no record of her being condemned to death. Her crime was railing speech. Her sentence was correction. But correction, when crafted in steel, becomes torture. And torture, when left to linger, becomes death. When they finally opened the cell, she was still breathing. Barely. Her chest rose once, then again. Her eyes fluttered toward the light, and in that moment, perhaps, she believed they had come to release her, to remove the mask, to let her speak one final time. They did not. They shut the door, wrote "Observation continued," and left. She died 3 days later. The body was buried quickly. There was no procession, no family, no priest. The mask was removed with tongs and a chisel. It took 4 men to pry it loose. The flesh came with it. That mask, twisted, blood-stained, lined with decay, was later cleaned and stored. It was used again, at least once, possibly more. This is the secret of objects made for punishment. They outlive their victims. They survive to silence the next voice, and the next, and the next. They are passed down not as relics, but as warnings. And what was left of Agnes, her body rotted in the earth, her name crossed from the record, her voice broken, her death unspoken. But the bridle remembers, and it whispers still. She spoke, and for that they made her mouth into a wound. Death did not come for Agnes in a single blow, nor in a fevered scream. It came like a long forgetting, a slow surrender of the body to the will of others. There was no gallows, no procession of red robes, no final verdict scrawled in the ledgers of Norfolk County. Her death was not recorded as justice. It was recorded as maintenance. As if the slow decay of her body beneath that iron jaw was no more remarkable than the wear of rope or the rust on a hinge. They found her in the early light, slumped to one side, chin dark with dried blood, head bowed in a grotesque imitation of prayer. The bridle remained locked. The tongue, already swollen, blackened and torn, had pressed upward in her final hours, suffocating her with her own silence. She had not died of a wound. She had not died of fever. She had died of the mask itself, of breath denied, of food withheld, of the long, searing corrosion of metal inside the human mouth. One guard, who had walked the halls for 15 years, refused to touch her. Another crossed himself and muttered that her eyes were still open, though no one had the courage to close them. They summoned a jailer's apprentice, barely old enough to shave, and gave him tongs, gloves, and a pail of vinegar. The task was simple: remove the mask. They did not explain how. He approached with the reverence of one touching something unholy. The iron would not budge. It had fused, not just to her mouth, but to her. Flesh had grown over edges. The hinge had locked into place with a scabbed seal of rot. It took hours. They soaked it. They twisted. They tore. In the end, it was not the mask that came free. It was Agnes. Strips of skin clung to the inner bit. Her lower lip, already split, tore open completely. Her jaw cracked when they forced the hinge. The apprentice vomited into his own shirt. The priest refused to enter the chamber. And then the mask sat alone on a table, glinting faintly in the early sun, as if it had never known flesh, as if it had not spent a fortnight digesting the soul of a woman, as if it were just an object, a relic of order, not an instrument of destruction. They burned her dress, buried her body in an unmarked pit behind the jail. No stone, no words. The grave was shallow and the earth barely disturbed, just another condemned to memory's ash heap. No procession, no bell, no name. But there was something else. A boy, a stable-hand son, later spoke of a thing he saw, a thing he shouldn't have. He said, as they stripped the bridle from her body, something fell from between her teeth. Not a tooth, not a splinter of tongue, a scrap of cloth, blood-stained, folded, damp. On it, 3 words, barely legible. I forgive you. No one believed him. But the story lingered, because forgiveness is not what they had expected. Not from her. Not after what they had done. And yet, perhaps it was a final defiance, a mercy they could not comprehend. In a world that fed itself on punishment, forgiveness was the only weapon left to the punished. Years later, the mask reappeared. Not in court, but in curiosity. In 1623, it was found in a parish storeroom, labelled only, "For Women of Noise." Its leather straps had rotted, but the iron remained intact. On the inner tongue plate, a deep groove had been worn down, cut not by design, but by repetition. The mark of movement, of struggle, of a tongue that had tried again and again to lift itself, to form a word, to remain alive. They did not melt it down. They preserved it, cleaned it, displayed it. First in the Hall of Punishment, then in the Town Museum. It was mounted on velvet, framed in glass. Its caption read, "Scold's Bridle. England, 16th century. Used to silence unruly women. A polite explanation. A lie dipped in lacquer. Because the truth was uglier. The truth was Agnes Cutter. And even as generations passed, and children pressed their noses to the glass, and mothers told them to move on, there was something in the shape of that mask that unsettled the air. A ghost not in voice, but in absence. The empty space where a mouth had once bled. The outline of suffering no history could fully erase. What does it mean to die, and yet remain? Agnes's bones crumbled in the soil long ago. Her name was not carved into any stone. Her story was not written into any law, but her death lingers, not because she was a martyr, or a hero, or even right, but because she was silenced, and in that silence we hear everything this world would rather forget. There was no gallows, no crown, no last words, only a body, a mask, and the echo of a woman who once dared to speak. And that was how silence killed. After Agnes Cutter died, the town exhaled, a quiet exhale, the kind that follows a storm you convinced yourself was worse than it really was. The magistrate wrote a line in his records, "Subject deceased during sentence." No signs of foul play. The clerk below him underlined the phrase, "No signs," twice. The jailers didn't argue. They had no reason to. She had died without resistance. She had decayed without complaint. That was the point, after all. Make the death slow enough that no one feels its edge. Let the punishment fade into background noise until it looks like something ordinary. She was not buried, not properly. They placed her in a trench behind the jail, alongside the limbs of thieves and unclaimed corpses, her body wrapped in old sackcloth. No coffin, no rites, no marker. The priest who had once looked upon her with suspicion refused to perform the final prayers. She made mockery of order, he was rumoured to have said. Let silence carry her across. But the silence did not carry her away. Not fully, because while the ledgers were wiped and the records sealed and her name scratched from the jailhouse wall, the people remembered. Not all of them. Not the steward. Not the blacksmith who forged the mask and received his coin. But the mothers, the daughters, the midwives who used to speak softly in her doorway when night came early, and their bruises ached in private. They remembered. They remembered because they could not afford to forget. For a time, her story travelled in hushed tones. They called it a warning. Don't speak too sharp, or you'll end like Agnes. And yet, in some households, it became a prayer. Say it like Agnes did, they whispered. Not out loud, not in the open, but behind curtains, between stitches, in the slow, careful way one passes flint in the dead of winter. In the years that followed, the town tried to erase her completely. A new magistrate came. The jail was expanded. The trench behind it paved over with gravel and lime. A garden was planted, then neglected, then built over. When the rain was heavy, the soil sometimes sank unevenly, as if something beneath had shifted. They taught children the names of saints, not the names of women who died for speaking. They built a new chapel, hung sermons in glass, reprinted the Book of Common Prayer. Every generation tried a little harder to forget the thing that had once lived in their own town square. But stories are not bound by ink. They bleed, even through silence. A century later, in 1684, a visiting historian passed through Norfolk and recorded a strange tale told by a candlemaker's widow. She said there had once been a woman who wore a muzzle because her tongue scared the men. The historian dismissed it as folklore, though he noted the detail of the iron mask was peculiarly consistent. That account vanished into footnotes, and yet it was told again and again. Not in books, but in breath. A girl in 1719 was bridled in a neighboring town for public profanity. When asked how she endured it, she replied, "At least I'm not Agnes." No one knew who she meant, but the name clung. What does it mean to be erased officially, but not spiritually? Agnes Cutter became more than a woman. She became a gap, a space where truth had once lived, now bordered by shame and myth. Her life had been dismantled, but her absence remained structured. It haunted the spaces it had once filled, the court, the market, the steps of the church, places where she had stood, where her voice had risen like a splinter in a sermon. And even if no one remembered the details, they remembered the unease. Perhaps that's what legacy really is. Not glory, but discomfort that refuses to die. The scold's bridle itself, the one she wore, was passed along quietly. Not officially, but through hands, from the jail to the archive, from the archive to a private collector, then to a museum curator who placed it under soft light and glass with no mention of her name. It became an object, a curiosity. "Used for disorderly women," read the caption. Beside it, a watercolor of a neatly dressed maiden, bridled but smiling, history rewritten for the gaze of tourists. But objects remember. They remember what people wish to bury. And the metal remembered her jaw. The bit remembered her tongue. The locks remembered how hard they had to strain to keep her silent. In 1907, a scholar studying punishment devices asked why the records of Agnes Cutter's sentencing were missing from the Norfolk archives. The clerk shrugged. "We don't hold records for common scolds," he said. Common. That was the word used to render her life forgettable. Common. As if she were one of many. As if her suffering did not matter. But common does not mean meaningless. It means shared. And perhaps that is why she remained. Not as a martyr, not as a saint, but as a mirror. A reflection of every woman who ever bit her tongue in a courtroom. Every girl who said sorry before speaking. Every mother who lowered her voice in fear it would be used against her. Agnes was buried without a stone, but the story was carved elsewhere, in gestures, in warnings, in the hesitation before a woman interrupts a man in public. The state erased her in ink, but the people carried her in memory, and memory, when sharpened, can wound deeper than any blade. Centuries have passed, and yet the iron still gleams, not with blood now, but with polish. The bridle that once tore into Agnes Cutter's tongue now rests beneath museum glass, sanitized, labeled, stripped of its scream. Scold's bridle, 16th century, used to punish disorderly women. Disorderly, as if it were a matter of poor posture, not a matter of power. No mention of Agnes, no mention of rot, no mention of what it means to silence a woman until her body breaks around the silence. Visitors pass by it without pause. Children glance and move on. Tourists whisper, "Imagine wearing that," and chuckle before drifting toward the next display case of antique spoons or Tudor chamber pots. But the bridal waits, and behind its polished mask, something remains, something heavy, unspoken. It is not just a piece of iron. It is the outline of a system, a weapon disguised as decorum, a scream that history tried to dress as justice. Because the truth is, Agnes didn't die for being wrong. She died for being heard. And though they removed her from the ledgers, they could not remove the aftertaste. Her story, half buried, half remembered, survived not in books, but in behavior, in the way women lowered their voices in court, in the way wives glanced down before contradicting their husbands, in the way fear became instinct, so deeply learned that no one had to say, "Be careful." They already knew. What does it mean when pain becomes policy, when punishment becomes tradition? The Scold's Bridle was never just about silencing words. It was about severing the soul from its freedom. It was about making a woman doubt that her voice had ever belonged to her. And the cruelty was not only in the pain, but in the parade, the public humiliation, the way children laughed, the way neighbors watched, because it wasn't enough for Agnes to suffer. She had to be seen suffering. That is the core of control, spectacle, and spectacle leaves shadows. You see them even now, in different forms, shaped for different times. A woman dismissed in a boardroom for speaking too passionately. A girl labeled difficult for expressing a boundary. A mother mocked for raising her voice in defense of her child. The bridle no longer needs to exist in metal. It has become psychological, internal, self-imposed. But legacy is a mirror, not a chain. In recent years, feminist scholars have spoken her name again, Agnes Cutter. Her story, once fragmented, has been reassembled from oral tales, fragments of court documents, and the meticulous decoding of women's letters passed down in families. A historian in 1998 gave a lecture titled Agnes and the Architecture of Silence. In it, she argued that no empire can endure without its ghosts, and that Agnes, though buried, is one such ghost. She is the bruise beneath the skin of order, the unhealed place beneath centuries of civilization. Artists have repainted her face. Poets have imagined her final thoughts. Activists have walked through Norwich wearing red cloth over their mouths in protest, bearing signs that say, "She spoke." And in a quiet corner of a feminist archive, there is a plaque with no name, no date, just a single line. The silence you carry may not be yours. That is her legacy. Not just the bridle, not just the rot, but the whisper that crawled through time, the question that will not close. Was she punished or preserved? Because to preserve something is to ensure it lasts, to make it permanent. And while they punished her in life, they preserved her in death by making her the shape of what they feared most, a woman who would not obey. She became a symbol, yes, but not just of resistance, of what resistance costs, and that, too, is part of the inheritance. Not every rebellion ends in triumph. Sometimes it ends in a cell, in silence, in a rusted mask. But the ending is not the whole story. Today we know her name, and that matters, because every time her name is spoken, every time a girl reads it, or a woman writes it, or a child hears it whispered in a classroom, it pulls her back from the place they tried to leave her. It unmuzzles her. So when people walk by that display case and glance at the iron mask, let them look closer. Let them feel the edges of something unsaid. Let them imagine, just for a moment, what it meant to wear that thing, not as costume, not as symbol, but as sentence, and let them remember, silence too has a voice. It echoes, it lingers, it shapes the world. Agnes Cutter is gone, but she was never quiet, and neither should we be. Agnes Cutter was not alone. Her story, as brutal and unforgettable as it is, was not an aberration. It was a pattern, a lineage of pain forged in iron and enacted across generations. The bridle that tore through her tongue was not made for her alone. It was replicated, refined, and redeployed against countless others, each silenced for a different reason, each forgotten in the same way. Their names rarely made the records, but their bruises remained, etched into the skin of history, like welts that never faded. In 1611, Isabel Gelly of Edinburgh was marched through the streets of Canongate, wearing a bridle so tightly fastened that the bit lodged behind her molars. Her crime, uttering curses against her husband's dominion. Witnesses said her teeth cracked before they reached the churchyard. The spike carved a slit in her tongue, and by nightfall she was vomiting blood. Her death was listed as natural. A fever, the authorities claimed. But fever does not twist a jawbone backward. 30 years earlier, in the winter of 1572, Marjorie Sibley was bridled in Suffolk. Accused of witchcraft and slander, she was forced to wear the mask for 3 days before being hanged. When her body was examined post-mortem, the jaw was dislocated, the nose broken. Her final words, if any, were never recorded. They said she died with her eyes open. Some said she was smiling, but the muscles of the face distort in death, and history often turns horror into poetry when it wants to forget the suffering. Each of these women wore a different mask, but the structure remained the same. Control through spectacle, pain wrapped in morality, iron forged not just to suppress, but degrade. Some bridles had bells attached, not as decoration, but as humiliation. The sound rang with every step, drawing attention to the shame on parade. Others were inscribed with phrases, "Peace in silence," or "tamed for God," words hammered into steel as if cruelty were a virtue. And still the masks were handmade, always handmade, custom measured to the victim's face, each spike fitted for a specific mouth, each hinge bent to match the curve of a woman's skull. There was no mass production of punishment. Each device bore the fingerprint of its maker, the signature of the society that allowed it to exist. In 1635, a Welsh parish record listed the sentencing of a mother of 6, known to quarrel, punished by bridle for raising discord in the presence of men. No name, just the role, mother. As though her identity had been stripped the moment her voice became inconvenient. A traveling minister later recorded that she was made to walk barefoot across 3 villages, the bit in place, escorted by 2 men with whips. When she collapsed, they doused her in cold water and forced her forward. She died 3 weeks later from what they called exhaustion of the womb. These stories are fragments, scattered across dusty court rolls, diary entries, family legends. No one tells them whole. No one preserved them with care. But they surface, again and again, like bones after heavy rain. Because the truth never stays buried. It presses upward, through the soil of forgetting, through the polished stone of official histories, until it reaches the light. And what it reveals is not anomaly, but structure. What does it mean when silence is ritualized? When generations of women are punished not for violence, not for betrayal, but for expression? Not all were bridled. Some were locked in stocks, some beaten, some simply married off to men who would continue the suppression behind closed doors. But the bridle is unique in its symbolism. It did not just punish the body. It desecrated the mouth, the very place of prayer, of laughter, of argument. It made the sacred profane and the profane sacred. It said, "Your voice is filth, and this is the proof." And yet, even within this darkness there were sparks, faint, fragile, flickering. A midwife in 1651 recorded that her aunt had been muzzled by the town, but not by God. She said she saw the mask removed, and the first words her aunt spoke were a blessing. She died the next morning. The midwife wore red ribbons on her sleeves for the rest of her life. No explanation. Just colour. Just defiance. In Scotland, a bridled woman's daughter grew to become a healer, and when asked why she refused to wed, she said only, "I've seen what happens when a man feels unheard." Small, personal rebellions, not enough to change the world, but enough to keep the memory alive. And it is memory, not monuments, that carries legacy forward. The museums rarely tell these stories. They present the objects, the mask, the whip, the ledger, with clinical detachment. But those who look closely can feel it. The absence, the ache, the shape of pain unspoken. It clings to the iron, it waits. Agnes Cutter was one. But she was not the only one. Her suffering was not isolated. It was echoed, multiplied, institutionalized, and through each repetition the message deepened. Not that women must not speak, but that women who do speak will be punished until others forget why they ever dared. But forgetting is not so simple, because the flesh remembers, and the earth does not keep secrets. And when enough voices are buried, with bridles in their mouths, the silence begins to hum with questions that cannot be ignored. Who made these masks? Who watched them used? Who said nothing? And perhaps most importantly, who still carries that silence inside their throat, waiting to speak? Agnes, Isabel, Marjorie, the mother of 6, the aunt in red ribbons, different names, same iron. And the iron still whispers. In 1982, beneath the rotting floorboards of an abandoned parish house in North Norfolk, a construction crew pried open a buried stone vault, sealed not with cement, but with rusted nails and old scripture pages, pressed flat against the cracks like forgotten prayers. They were not looking for history. They were there to install new wiring, but what they found instead was a box. Oak, reinforced with tarnished brass. No markings, no lock. Just dust, silence, and the weight of something that had waited far too long to be touched again. Inside, an iron bridle. Unlike the others known to historians, this one bore no decorative engraving, no date, no town seal. It was brutally plain. The iron was darker, almost black, and smoother than most museum specimens. No rust on the bit, no cracks in the strap loops. But it was old, very old. The inside of the tongue plate showed a deep groove, worn exactly where the flesh would press. This was not ceremonial. This had been used. And yet, there was something else, something deeply wrong. Along the outer curve of the crown plate, just beneath the brow band, a faint inscription had been etched, not in English, not in Latin, but in Church Slavonic. The translation came months later, after the object had passed through 3 universities and 1 private collector. 2 words, carved with a steady hand, Veritas Secreta, the secret truth. No records tied it to a specific case, no execution log referenced it. No jail or bishop's court admitted to its design. Even the metal was off, an unusual iron composite, softer, more flexible, almost surgical in quality. Too advanced for the time, or too forgotten. Local historians were puzzled, then disturbed. One woman, a folklorist from Cambridge, made the connection that would ignite a silent storm. The dimensions of the bridle matched precisely those found in the autopsy sketch of Agnes Cutter's skull, a drawing hidden inside an unindexed, 1587 physician's notebook, buried in the back of an estate archive that had not been catalogued in over 2 centuries. The match was exact. Jaw hinge, brow span, bit length, all identical. But that was not the strangest part. Folded inside the oak box, beneath the bridle, was a square of linen, blood-stained, faded, and wrapped around something heavy. When unwrapped, it revealed a single molar, darkened with age, the root intact, with a shard of iron fused into the root canal, a fragment of the bit, grown into bone, pulled out with it. The team went quiet. The story was shelved. The object was moved to private storage. It never reached the museum floor, because what do you do when you find the artifact that should not exist? When a punishment becomes a relic, then becomes a witness. Word spread anyway, as it always does. Quietly. Through rumor, through research circles, through late-night discussions in the back halls of academic conferences. And then something else surfaced. A letter, unmarked, unsigned, dated 1592, discovered folded into the binding of a fire-damaged hymn book from Norwich. It read, "Forgive me for what I did." The mask was not just for silence. It was to keep the rest of her inside. We had begun to believe the voice was not hers. I don't think she died, not properly. Her words never stopped. They just moved. No signature, no recipient, just a hand, stiff, shaking, scrawled in ink made faint by centuries. There are those who say the mask found in 1982 is Agnes's, that someone, decades after her death, retrieved it, wrapped it, and hid it beneath the ground, not to honor her, but to bury the power they could no longer control, because sometimes an object outlives its purpose, and sometimes the object becomes the purpose. There are stories, too, in Norfolk, old ones, barely whispered, of a woman seen walking the fields outside the former jail, mouth clamped, gown soaked in blood, always silent, always watching. They call her the Quiet One. Children dared to speak her name 3 times before bed. Some still do. The parish where the mask was found has since been converted into a flat. The oak box was moved. The molar, lost in transport, or so they say. But one curator kept the inscription, framed it above her desk, and whenever asked what it meant, she says only, "Sometimes silence holds more truth than confession ever could." Because silence is never just the absence of sound. It is a shape, a presence, and this bridle, was more than punishment. It was transformation, not just of the woman who wore it, but of the people who watched, who judged, who turned away. It made them all participants, carriers, vessels of what had been forced into stillness. And now that stillness has moved. The iron that spoke no name speaks still. Not through voice, but through every space where truth is avoided. Every corner where history pretends to be whole. Every display case that leaves the caption clean. Agnes Cutter was buried. But the mask? The mask remembers. They called her a scold, a disturber of peace, a woman too quick with her tongue and too slow to repent. And for this, they built her cage. They forged her silence. They watched her die behind iron, and they wrote it down as correction. Not execution. Not torture. Correction. But was she guilty? That is the question that hovers, unsatisfied, at the edge of every retelling. Not because the facts are unclear, but because the definition of guilt shifts like smoke, depending on who holds the torch. If guilt is merely breaking the rules, then yes, Agnes Cutter broke them. She named the powerful. She shamed the priest. She unsettled the marketplace with truths that bit harder than gossip. She refused to be small. She refused to retreat. She refused to say sorry. If that is guilt, then she was drowning in it. But if guilt requires harm, measurable, malice-born harm, then where is the evidence? She wielded no blade, set no fires, called for no violence. She spoke. She remembered. She resisted the slow decay of public memory, and in doing so, made enemies of those who relied on forgetting. Is that harm, or is it history clawing its way back into light? The answer lies not in the records, but in the reactions. She was not warned once, but many times. Her neighbors whispered. Her cousin betrayed her. The magistrate branded her a lesson. This is not the treatment of a criminal, it is the treatment of a threat. Not because she was wrong, but because she was disruptive, and disruption is intolerable to those who benefit from stillness. So they asked her to repent. She did not. They offered her peace in exchange for obedience. She refused. They told her that silence was survival. She bled instead. Does guilt survive such choices? Or is that courage? Bitter, brutal courage that leaves the body broken, but the story intact. Perhaps the more honest question is not, was she guilty? But who was guilty for what was done to her? Was it the blacksmith who shaped the bit to her mouth? The steward who filed the complaint? The cousin who traded her name for comfort? The jailer who locked the door? The townspeople who watched and said nothing? Or was it a guilt too vast for any one name? A collective inheritance dressed in law and wrapped in scripture, passed down generation after generation until it no longer felt like violence but simply how things were? If so, then Agnes Cutter was not guilty. She was an offering. A woman burned not by fire but by structure, not by rage, but by the quiet bureaucracy of suppression. And if you still believe she deserved what she received, then ask yourself this. Why does her story ache centuries later? Why do we still feel the heat of her mask, the weight of her silence, the pull of her name through the void? Because guilt fades, but injustice echoes. We remember her not because she was perfect, not because she was polite, not because she was gentle, but because she bore witness to something cruel, and because cruelty, when exposed, makes the world flinch. She was not guilty. She was punished. And in that distinction, we begin to see not only who she was, but who we still are. She died alone. No monument, no name carved in stone, no choir, no mourning bell, just a mouth that could no longer hold its shape, a body curled like paper, scorched at the edges, and a silence so deep it throbbed. But she was not forgotten. Agnes Cutter became something more than the iron that destroyed her, more than the rot, the blood, or the records that refused to name what had been done. She became the wound beneath the surface of history, the soft, unhealed place that pulses when we dare to ask why obedience was worth a woman's breath. They tried to reduce her to a lesson. Speak too much, and suffer. But her legacy slipped the bridle. It moved without voice, beneath floorboards, inside stories, through gestures, a glance shared between women in courtrooms, a daughter taught how to speak carefully, a mother refusing to lower her voice in the market. Her legacy is not carved in stone, because it never needed stone. It was carried in the blood, whispered between ribs, written in the shape of every woman who has ever held her tongue, and every woman who never could. The world that destroyed Agnes did not vanish. It evolved. It replaced iron with subtler instruments, laws that don't say silence, but mean it. Punishments not forged in fire, but in bureaucracy, in ridicule, in exile. The bridle now comes without hinges. It comes in disbelief, in the framing of women as hysterical, unpleasant, too loud, too angry. It lives in algorithms, in closed doors, in the raised eyebrow that says, "You should have known better." And yet, they still speak. We still speak. Agnes's story did not end in that cell. It was kept alive not by historians, but by discomfort, by the quiet shame of those who looked away, by the children who asked too many questions, by the iron that refused to rust. What does it mean to be remembered in flame? It means you were burned, but not consumed. It means your suffering illuminated something too ugly to ignore. It means your absence lit the path forward for those who remained. She never asked to be a martyr. She never called herself brave. She only asked to be heard. And when they refused her that, she gave them something more permanent than sound. She gave them guilt. And from that guilt, awareness. And from awareness, change. One day, someone will visit the glass case that holds the bridle and ask, not "What is this?" but "Who was she?" And if we answer honestly, if we speak her name, not as symbol, but as person, then the silence will finally break. Agnes Cutter did not survive, but she endured. And in her absence, we are left with the task her voice began: to speak, to remember, to refuse. The fire that ended her was not made of flame, it was made of silence, but silence burns too, and that is how she became louder than any scream.